The night Cecily Hartwell stood in the center of the Pemworth ballroom and refused to disappear. She was wearing a gown she had altered 3 times, and the candles above her were so bright she could see her own shadow pooling at her feet like a second self, one she could not outrun. Every face in the room had turned toward her, fans stilled, conversations severed mid-syllable, and the man she had been traded to, like a settlement on a gaming debt, was crossing the floor toward her with a steadiness that made the crowd part without his asking. She did not yet know what he would say. She knew only that she would not move. But we must begin where she had begun, which was not in a ballroom at all. Edmund Hartwell lost £30,000 between the 14th and 16th of October across 3 nights at a private table in St. James's, and he came home on the morning of the 17th with the expression of a man who had already decided the fault lay elsewhere. Cecily was at breakfast when he arrived, her cup of tea cooling at her elbow, the morning correspondence arranged in 2 neat piles as their father had taught her to do it. She was 23 years old, and she had lived inside the particular quiet of their reduced household long enough to read the quality of Edmund's silence before he crossed the threshold. He was 30 years old, her brother, and he had their father's height, and none of their father's judgment. And when he set his hat on the sideboard and did not look at her, she felt the cold arrive before the words did. The arrangement, he said, was already in principle agreed. He had spoken with the Duke of Ashmore's solicitor the previous evening. The Duke required a wife to satisfy the terms of a trust their late father had established, a trust that would otherwise revert to a distant cousin at the year's end. Edmund's debt of £30,000 would be absorbed into the estate account and treated as settled. Cecily would go to Ashmore Park as the Duke's intended bride, and the formalities would follow. She set down her cup. She asked, very carefully, whether the Duke had been consulted on his own inclination in the matter. Edmund said that the Duke of Ashmore did not appear to have strong inclinations in any direction, and that the arrangement was satisfactory to all relevant parties. She was not, apparently, a relevant party. She said nothing further, because she had learned that silence was the one response Edmund could not manipulate, and she spent the remainder of that morning in her small sitting room, with her hands folded in her lap, sitting quite still while the world she had known reorganized itself around a fact she had not chosen. Ashmore Park was 4 hours north by carriage, through country that flattened and then narrowed as the road wound toward a gray horizon. Cecily arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October, her trunk containing 3 day dresses, 2 evening gowns, a volume of Cowper she had carried since childhood, and the small amount of pin money she had managed to keep separate from Edmund's reach, which amounted at present to 4 shillings and some pence. She had sewn the coins into a fold in her traveling cloak on the morning she left, not knowing whether she would need them, knowing only that she wanted to have something that was wholly hers. The house itself was larger than she had imagined, stone-fronted and winter-pale against the lowering sky, with rows of windows that caught the late light and held it dully. A steward named Graves met her at the door. He was an elderly man with the careful precision of someone who had served the same household for decades without ever finding it necessary to rush, and he welcomed her with a gravity that was respectful without being warm. She catalogued him as she catalogued all new spaces, the set of his shoulders, the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved to her trunk and then back to her face, with an assessment that was neither unkind nor welcoming. The Duke of Ashmore was in London on business. He would return in 2 days. She was shown to her rooms, which were large and cold and furnished with the kind of careful impersonality that suggested the previous occupant had been removed rather than departed. A fire had been laid, but not lit. A vase of winter roses stood on the mantel, already shedding their petals onto the marble. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, and then she knelt at the grate and lit the fire herself, because there was no reason to wait for someone else to do it. It was on her second morning at Ashmore Park that she found the girl. She had risen early, as she always did, and had walked the back corridor toward the kitchen passage because she wanted bread before the household assembled for breakfast, and because she disliked asking for things she could retrieve herself. The girl was sitting on the stone step that led down to the scullery, her apron twisted in her hands, her face the particular colorless shade of someone who had been crying long enough that the crying had stopped and left only the residue of it. She was perhaps 15 years old, with red hands and a gap between her front teeth, and she stood up immediately when she heard Cecily's step. Her name was Nell, and she had been a scullery maid at Ashmore Park for 8 months. A week prior, the housekeeper had deducted 2 shillings from her quarterly wages on the grounds that a blue porcelain saucer had been broken, and the breakage attributed to Nell's carelessness. Nell said, quietly and without self-pity, that she had not broken the saucer. She said it the way people say things they have already said several times to several people who did not listen. Cecily asked how much of her quarterly wage remained after the deduction. 3 shillings and 4pence, Nell said. Cecily stood in the cold corridor and calculated without visible pause. She reached into the fold of her cloak where she had sewn the coins, opened the seam with 2 fingers, and counted out 2 shillings onto her palm. She placed them in Nell's red hand. She said that the saucer's breakage would be noted as unattributed, and that if anyone questioned it, Nell was to refer them to her. Nell stared at the coins with an expression that contained the whole machinery of disbelief resolving into relief, and she said, very quietly, "Thank you, miss." Cecily said it was nothing, which was not quite true, and returned to her rooms. She did not see the man who stood at the far end of the corridor, close against the stone wall, still as everything else in that cold passage. He was not Graves, though Graves stood 2 steps behind him. He was taller than she had imagined the Duke of Ashmore to be, and he had returned from London a day earlier than expected, and he had been in that corridor long enough to have seen everything. He would not have described what he felt as he watched her as anything so straightforward as admiration. He had learned to distrust admiration, had learned that its object almost always failed in direct proportion to how urgently he had felt it. He observed Cecily in that corridor, and felt instead a quality of attention that had no name he was willing to give it, a focusing of something in him that had been generally diffuse for a very long time. He said nothing to Graves. He walked back toward his study, and Graves followed, and neither of them spoke. Graves, however, was watching him with the patience of a man who had known the Duke since boyhood, and that evening, when Adrian sat at his desk with the estate ledgers open and untouched before him, Graves set a cup of coffee at his right hand and said, without inflection, that the young lady had paid the maid's wages from her own pocket. Adrian said he was aware. Graves said he thought his Grace might find it relevant. Adrian did not reply. He opened the ledger to the appropriate page and began to read figures that he had already memorized. Graves withdrew without another word, which was what Graves always did when a point had been made sufficiently. She met him formally that afternoon, in the drawing room, which was the room in the house she had already decided she liked least. Too much gilt, too little light. The furniture arranged for observation rather than comfort. Adrian Vane, Duke of Ashmore, was 31 years old, and he entered the room with the quality of a man who had long since stopped expecting rooms to offer him anything he wanted. He was dark-haired, clean-shaved, with a face that told nothing. Not cold in the sense of cruelty, but cold in the sense of a fire banked so completely that you could not tell from the outside whether anything still burned. He said good afternoon. She returned the greeting. He asked whether her rooms were adequate. She said they were. He said the solicitor had forwarded the relevant documents and that she would find them on the escritoire in the library should she wish to review them. He said this with the precise neutrality of a man conveying information rather than apology, and she understood that he intended no softening because he did not see the need for one. She understood it, and she disliked it, and she met his eyes steadily across the 8 feet of Turkish carpet that separated them, and said that she would review the documents at her convenience. Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile, and it was gone too quickly to characterize. But it was a response, and she filed it carefully. Over the days that followed, they circled each other with the careful propriety of 2 people sharing a space neither had chosen. She used the library in the mornings because the library was the only room in the house that had been kept warm against the season as a matter of habit rather than occasion, and because the collection was genuinely good. She found on her 3rd morning that the book she had been reaching for had been placed on a lower shelf, where it was easier to access, though she had said nothing to anyone about the difficulty. On her 4th morning, the fire in the library was lit an hour earlier than it had been the day before. She did not mention these things. She noted them. The evening they spent together in the library, late in the 2nd week, was not planned by either of them. She had been reading by the fire when he came in, and he had hesitated in the doorway long enough that she had looked up, and he had come in anyway. Because the alternative would have required an explanation neither of them was prepared to offer. He sat at the desk. She returned to her book. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which was itself a kind of information. After an hour, he said, without looking up from his papers, that she had managed Nell's situation with more discretion than the housekeeper had shown. She said she did not know what he meant. He said he had spoken to Graves. She held the page of her book without turning it. He said, still without looking up, that the housekeeper had been reminded of her responsibilities in the matter. She understood then that he had not only observed, but had acted, and that he had done so without requiring her thanks or her awareness, and the sensation that moved through her in that moment was not gratitude, exactly, though it contained gratitude. It was the specific shock of being treated as though your actions had consequences worth accounting for. She had not felt that in some time. She said quietly that she appreciated it. He looked up then, for a long moment, and then returned to his papers. The fire crackled between them. Outside the library windows, the last leaves came off the oak in the courtyard, one at a time, in the dark. If you are finding yourself in this story as Cecily is finding herself in that library, with the slow and almost painful recognition that something unexpected is being offered, consider leaving a word in the comments below, because the best conversations this channel has had began exactly where this story is beginning now, at the point where a woman stops waiting to be dismissed and starts noticing that she has not been. The Dowager Duchess arrived on a Saturday. She had not announced her intention to come, because she was the sort of woman who considered announcement a courtesy owed to people of lesser authority, and she did not believe there was anyone at Ashmore Park of lesser authority in whom she was obliged to invest the gesture. Lady Dorothea Vane was 62 years old, precisely groomed, and carried herself with the compressed dignity of someone who had spent 40 years defending the social order and found the exercise entirely natural. She arrived in a carriage with the Ashmore crest on the door and swept into the front hall with her maid behind her before Graves had finished reading her card. She found Cecily in the drawing room. She looked at Cecily with the patient, practiced assessment of a woman who had spent a lifetime measuring other women against a standard she had herself constructed, and she said, as though observing the weather, that she had imagined Edmund Hartwell's sister would be rather younger. Cecily said that she was 23. Dorothea said that yes, she could see that. and that she supposed Adrian had agreed to the arrangement because the terms were convenient, rather than because anyone had imagined the match to be suitable in the ordinary sense. She said it without malice, which made it worse. It was the tone of a woman stating a categorization, the way one might note that a piece of furniture was in the wrong room, not condemning it, merely locating its misplacement. She said that Edmund's debt of £30,000 had made for a very particular kind of bargaining, hadn't it? And that Cecily must understand that what suited a solicitor's ledger did not always suit a family's standing. Cecily held the dowager's gaze and did not answer. She had learned, from years of managing Edmund's domestic wreckage, that the people who used this register expected protest, because protest allowed them to escalate, and silence denied them that pleasure. Dorothea moved on. She inspected the drawing room. She inquired about the menus. She made 3 observations about the arrangement of the furniture that were technically suggestions and structurally corrections. She departed to her rooms with the satisfaction of a woman who had established a position from which she intended to continue operating. Cecily sat in the drawing room after she had gone and looked at the revised arrangement of the furniture, which she had not altered, and made note of the quality of resistance she was going to need to find. Adrian did not apologize for his mother. She did not expect him to. He said at dinner that Dorothea had opinions, and that the house generally found them easier to accommodate than to contest. He said it with a flatness that told her the observation was description rather than endorsement. And she looked at him across the candlelight and thought, he knows exactly what she is. He simply has not yet decided whether it matters enough to act on. What she did not know then, and what she learned in fragments over the days that followed, was that Adrian had carried a specific silence with him for 4 years. His first wife had been named Frances. She had died in childbed on a February night when he had been in London on business that, in retrospect, could have waited a week. He had returned to Ashmore Park the following morning, to a house that had been rearranged around a grief he had not been present to begin. He had made no dramatic gestures. He had removed Frances's portrait from the gallery and turned it to face the wall in a small room at the end of the east corridor. And he had blamed himself in the private, grinding way that leaves no room for other people's comfort. Because it does not believe it deserves any. Graves told Cecily none of this directly. What he told her was that the east corridor room was kept locked, and that no one went in, and that the late Duchess had been a woman of considerable warmth, and that His Grace had taken her death very hard. He said it with the economy of someone who had watched a person he cared about move through a long grief and had not known how to reach him. Cecily did not reach for it. She had enough of her own weight to carry. She filed it in the same careful place she filed everything she observed about Adrian. The way he stood at the library window in the early morning with his coffee cooling in his hand. The way he spoke to Graves with an attention that was not rank-performing courtesy, but genuine regard. The way his jaw tightened when Edmund's name was mentioned in correspondence, not in anger, she thought, but in the specific tension of a man holding something in place that had not yet been resolved. She did not tell herself she was falling in love with him. She was not a woman who permitted herself that particular luxury without evidence. She told herself she was beginning to understand him, which was true, and that understanding of that quality was its own sort of gravity, pulling quietly, without announcement. The Pemworth ball came in the 3rd week of November. It was given by Mrs. Pemworth at Pemworth House, which was 4 miles from Ashmore Park and had a ballroom that had been redecorated in the previous season at considerable expense, the new wallpaper being gold-leafed and busy in the way of a room trying too hard to impress people it had already impressed. Cecily wore her blue evening gown, which had been retrimmed once and was still presentable. Dorothea wore sapphires. Rosalind Pemworth, who was Mrs. Pemworth's niece and 20 years old, and possessed of the serene confidence of a young woman who had never been told she was anything less than perfectly suitable, wore white silk with blonde lace at the sleeves, and managed to be positioned near the door when Adrian arrived, so that she greeted him with a smile of prepared warmth. Cecily watched the greeting and thought, "This is the correct choice. By every measure this room would recognize." She felt no jealousy, which surprised her. What she felt was a kind of resigned clarity. She understood the arithmetic. Dorothea found her 20 minutes into the evening, near the window bay that looked out onto the frozen garden. She was with two other women, Lady Forthright and Mrs. Pelham, who were of the type that organized themselves in proximity to the dowager for warmth, and Dorothea said, with a smile that did not reach past her teeth, that she hoped Cecily was enjoying the evening, and that she must find these occasions somewhat unfamiliar, given her circumstances. She said that £30,000 was a very precise figure for a betrothal, wasn't it? And that one couldn't help but feel Edmund Hartwell had rather got the better of the arrangement. Lady Forthright laughed a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Mrs. Pelham examined her fan. Cecily said evenly that she hoped the dowager was enjoying the evening. Dorothea regarded her with the specific patience of a woman who had expected that answer and was prepared for the next move. It was Rosalind Pemworth who moved the evening toward its crisis, though not by her own design. She was dancing with Edmund, who had arrived from London that afternoon, with the cheerful disregard of a man who does not understand that the ground has changed beneath him. And in the interval between dances, she brought Edmund to Adrian's elbow and said, with a bright social precision that she clearly believed was helpfulness, that surely the arrangement could not continue to be so awkward for everyone, and that really, if Adrian were to make his preference known, no one would think less of him for it. Edmund, who was already flushed with the Pemworth claret, said that this was exactly so, and that in point of fact he had a thing or two to say on the subject himself, and that he had been meaning to say it this very evening. Adrian's face showed nothing. His hands, at his sides, were still. Edmund crossed to the floor's center, where the conversation was thickest, and raised his glass. He said, with the deliberate projection of a man who had convinced himself he was managing a practical matter rather than performing a betrayal, that he wished to advise those present that the arrangement between his sister and the Duke of Ashmore had always been understood by both parties to be provisional, and that it was his expectation, shared he believed by his grace, that the matter would be dissolved in the coming days, and that no further awkwardness need be sustained by anyone. The room's noise reduced to a focused quiet. He said that Miss Rosalind Pemworth was a young woman of considerable family and clear suitability, and that no one present could fail to see where a more natural alliance lay. Cecily stood near the window bay, with the frozen garden behind her, and felt the blow land precisely in the place she had always known, at her deepest level, to be unguarded. This was the specific shape of the wound she had carried since the morning Edmund set his hat on the sideboard. Not that she had been traded, but that she was expected to accept the terms without objection, to make herself small enough that the inconvenience of her was invisible, and to disappear as efficiently as she had arrived. The room was watching her. She felt it. The assembled regard of every person in that room. Their expectation that she would drop her eyes or excuse herself, or do the quiet, dignified thing that amounted, in its effect, to agreeing. Dorothea, across the room, allowed herself one small measure of satisfaction. She had not orchestrated this moment, but she had expected something like it, and she had her answer ready for when Cecily retreated. Cecily did not retreat. She stood up straighter. which was the only motion available to her in that gown, in that room, in that life. And she said, clearly enough that the people nearest her could hear every word, that she wished to correct a misapprehension. She said that she had not been advised of any intention to dissolve the arrangement, and that she would expect such an intention to be communicated to her directly, rather than announced to a ballroom before it was announced to her. She said that she was Edmund Hartwell's sister, and she was fully aware of the nature of the agreement under which she had come to Ashmore Park, and that she did not require anyone to pretend otherwise on her behalf, but that she was also a person of her own constitution, and that she had lived at Ashmore Park for 3 weeks, and that she had not, in those 3 weeks, conducted herself as a woman who expected to be disposed of at someone else's convenience. Her voice did not waver. She had rehearsed nothing. The words were simply true. And truth, she had found, had its own forward momentum once you stopped trying to protect people from it. The room was very quiet. Edmund stared at her with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle in a place he had not expected an obstacle to exist. She did not look at Adrian. She looked at Edmund, and at Dorothea, and at the assembled room that had watched her be named a debtor's bargain 3 times in 3 settings. And she held all of their attention without apology. It was Graves she noticed first, standing near the door to the corridor, still and attentive, with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to see something confirmed. Then she heard the footsteps. Not hurried. Adrian did not cross a room as a man who rushed. He crossed it as a man who had decided, and whose decision had resolved all questions of speed or hesitation, and the crowd's movement away from his path was the unconscious response of people who recognized the quality of intentionality when it was moving toward them. He stopped beside her. He turned to face the room, and then he turned to face her specifically, which was the order that mattered. And he said, in a voice that was level and quiet enough that anyone beyond the immediate circle had to hold their breath to catch it, that the arrangement was not provisional. He said, because this was a man whose discipline was the architecture of everything he did, and he was not going to dismantle it entirely in a ballroom, that he wished to be clear on the point. He said that Cecily had come to Ashmore Park under terms that he found entirely satisfactory, and that if Edmund had formed the impression that any aspect of those terms was subject to revision at Edmund's discretion, Edmund had formed that impression without evidence. Edmund began to speak. Adrian looked at him. Edmund did not speak. The silence that followed was of the held, formal quality that occurs when a room collectively decides that whatever comes next will be remembered. Adrian turned back to Cecily, and the room was not gone. It was entirely present, every candlelit face of it. And he said, "You stayed." 2 words. She had expected a longer speech, had prepared her composure for something she would need to endure gracefully. And instead he had given her 2 words that arrived with the full weight of everything he had observed and not said and acted upon in quiet. And she felt them land in the place behind her sternum that had been cold since the morning Edmund came home from St. James's. She said, "Yes." He offered her his arm. She took it. Dorothea Vane stood across the room in her sapphires and looked at the 2 of them, and something moved across her face that was neither defeat nor capitulation, but a more complicated reckoning. The specific expression of a woman who had organized her entire social intelligence around a set of categories and was encountering, for the first time in some years, something her categories could not contain. She closed her fan. She did not speak. She did not, in fact, speak for the remainder of the evening, which was perhaps the most significant thing about her that night. Rosalind Pemworth looked at Edmund, who had nothing to offer her, and understood that the evening had not produced what she had expected. She did not make a scene. She returned to her aunt's side, and her expression settled into the contained composure of a young woman revising her plans. And that was the last significant thing she did that night. Edmund left the ballroom at 10:30. He did not say goodbye to Cecily. The carriage he departed in was Mrs. Pemworth's, borrowed in haste, and Graves, who had seen him leave, noted the fact and mentioned it to no one, because it was the kind of information that managed itself. The conversation she had that night with Adrian, on the drive back to Ashmore Park, was not long. The carriage lanterns threw warm light against the glass, and the road was very dark outside them, and she was tired in the specific way of a person who has spent a long time holding something correctly and has finally been allowed to set it down. He said, after a silence of perhaps 3 miles, that she had been braver than was required of her. She said that she had been exactly as brave as she needed to be. He said that he had asked Graves that evening to have the solicitor confirm the arrangements in full by the end of the week, so that there was no further ambiguity for anyone to work with. She looked at him in the carriage light and said, "You did not ask me whether I wanted that." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Do you want it?" She said, "Yes." He said, with the quality of a man who was cautiously learning to give things words, that he was glad of it. The snow came to Ashmore Park in the first week of December. It came quietly, the way all the significant things in that house arrived, without announcement, without the warning of wind. Simply a morning on which the windows were white when she woke. She lay in bed for a moment, looking at the white light on the ceiling, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, that she was in the right place. Graves brought her coffee in the library, as had become the habit, and she sat with it in the chair nearest the fire, and looked out at the courtyard where the snow was still falling, small and steady, covering the stone in a silence that was not empty, but accumulated. She had been to the East Corridor the previous afternoon. She had not gone to intrude. She had been looking for a particular atlas she remembered seeing on a shelf there, and the room was unlocked, which she did not think was an accident. The portrait was in the corner, its face turned to the wall, and she had stood looking at it for a long time. Frances had been, by the evidence of the painting, a woman with a generous mouth and a direct gaze, and the painter had caught something in the quality of her attention that made the portrait feel inhabited. Cecily had not moved it then. She had stood with it a while, and she had thought about grief that does not externalize, and about the particular cruelty of being absent at the moments that demand presence. She brought it to Adrian that evening. She carried it herself, through the East Corridor and along the hall to his study, and she set it on the low table before the fire, facing out. He was at his desk. He went still in the way she had come to recognize. Not stiffening, but concentrating. All of him gathered into the single point of the thing that had happened. He did not speak for a moment. She said quietly that she had not done it to disturb him. She said that the portrait deserved a room with light, and that wherever he wanted it placed, she would see to it, but that it had seemed wrong to her for it to be turned to the wall. He looked at the portrait. His jaw held the tension she had catalogued before, but underneath it, visible now in the firelight, was something else. The particular rawness of a person looking at something they have been avoiding, and finding that it hurts less than the avoidance had. He said, after a moment, that Frances had always preferred the library. Cecily said that they could put it there, if he liked. He said, yes. They carried it together, which was not a ceremonial act but a practical one. 2 people managing a frame through a corridor and into a warm room. And when they had hung it on the wall between the window and the nearest shelf, he stepped back and looked at it with an expression that was grief, and something past grief. The slight, involuntary relaxation of a person who has held a thing in tension for 4 years and has been permitted, gently, and by someone who asked nothing in return, to hold it differently. He said, "Thank you, Cecily." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She said, "Of course." The library fire burned steadily. Outside the window, the snow was still coming down, small and steady over the courtyard and the oak and the long, pale drive. Graves appeared in the doorway with 2 fresh candles and looked at the portrait on the wall and looked at the 2 of them and said nothing at all, which was Graves's particular eloquence, she thought. Standing in that room with the snow outside and the portrait of Frances on the wall and Adrian beside her with his careful hands and his earned silence, that this was what home felt like, not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of every complication, but the specific quality of being known by someone whose knowing was not a performance of courtesy, but a continuous act of attention. She had not expected to find it. She had expected, for most of the previous year, to endure. She was still 23. There was time for everything. £30,000 had brought her to a house she would have chosen herself, which was the kind of irony she filed under the heading of her brother's very occasional, inadvertent usefulness, and she smiled at the thought, privately, with her back to Adrian while she straightened the portrait by 2 degrees. He saw her smile. He said nothing. She could feel that he had seen it, in the specific way you feel attention on your back, when it has a quality distinct from ordinary regard, and she was content to let it sit there, unspoken, accumulating with everything else. The candles that Graves had set on the mantel threw their light up the library walls and across the spines of the books and across the portrait of Frances, who looked out at the room now with her direct, inhabited gaze, restored to her proper place in a house that was also, finally, Cecily's. The snow fell outside the window, small and steady and even, and covered everything that had come before it, in a white that was not erasure, but only the quiet, patient layering of what came next. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you longest. Every response is read, and this channel exists because you keep returning to it.